They fined him thousands for fishing in his own backyard. They thought they had won, but you won't believe the multi-million-dollar checkmate he planned in secret. This isn't just a story about a lake, it's about the ultimate revenge. Don't miss what happens when one man takes on an entire HOA. The shadow fell across his fishing line first, a sudden eclipse on the sunlit water that was as unwelcome as it was deliberate. Frank Miller didn't need to look up to know who it belonged to. The scent of sharp, floral perfume, a fragrance that always seemed more chemical than natural, had already announced her arrival. It was the smell of order, of rules, of a world meticulously scrubbed of any messy joy. It was the smell of Carol Preston. "Mr. Miller," she said. The name came out clipped, an indictment in 3 syllables. Frank kept his eyes fixed on the gentle bob of his fishing float. He had been having a good morning, one of the first truly peaceful ones in weeks. The air was soft with the promise of summer, and the lake, his lake, was a sheet of deep, tranquil blue. He had just been thinking of Martha, of how she loved the way the morning sun caught the ripples on the water, turning them into 1,000 tiny diamonds. The memory was warm, a small comfort he held close in the quiet of his retirement. Carol's voice was a stone thrown into that stillness. He finally turned, slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. He saw her standing at the edge of his property, where his unkempt lawn met the perfectly manicured green of the community parkland. She was flanked by her 2 usual lieutenants from the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Stan and Brenda. Stan, a perpetually nervous man who seemed to wish he were anywhere else, was studying his own shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. Brenda stood stiffly, clutching a clipboard like a shield. But Carol was in her element, a monarch surveying a rebellious province. She wore a starched floral blouse, beige slacks creased to a razor's edge, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded a face set in permanent disapproval. "Carol," Frank acknowledged, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry much farther than the edge of his weathered dock. He made no move to stand. Her lips thinned into a bloodless line. "We have sent you multiple notices. Mr. Miller, 2, to be precise, regarding your flagrant disregard for community bylaws." "My fishing?" Frank asked, a hint of weary amusement in his tone. He reached for his bait bucket, the earthy smell of fresh worms a familiar comfort. "Do not be obtuse," she snapped. Taking a step forward, the heels of her sensible shoes sank slightly into the soft turf. "You know perfectly well this is about your violation of Bylaw 117, Section C, Ecological Preservation Mandate. The use of unauthorized, non-native live bait is strictly prohibited." Frank paused, his hand hovering over the bucket. "These are earthworms, Carol, from a compost pile in my backyard. They're about as native as the dirt they live in. They are not the approved, farm-raised, nutrient-neutral larvae available for purchase from the community supplier," she retorted, as if reciting from a holy text. "Your actions risk introducing unpredictable biological elements into the lake's delicate, managed ecosystem." Frank almost laughed. This lake had been a wild, muddy pond when he and Martha bought their plot of land 30 years ago. He had fished for bass and bream in it, using worms from his garden, for more than a decade before the first developer's sign for Harmony Creek Estates had ever been hammered into the ground. The only thing managed about the ecosystem was the obsessive trimming of the reeds along the HOA-controlled shoreline. "I'm not paying the fine," Frank said, his voice quiet but absolute. He turned back to his rod, threading a fresh worm onto the hook. The simple, familiar action was an act of defiance. "The initial fine was $50. Carol's voice rose, slicing through the quiet air. "Due to your non-compliance, it was increased to $100, with the additional late fees and the continued violation today. Your outstanding balance is now $250. Brenda made a small mark on her clipboard. "You can send me a bill for $1 million. "Carol, I'm not paying for the right to fish on my own property the way I always have." "It is not your property," she exclaimed, her voice vibrating with indignation. "The lake is a community asset. Your property line ends at the high water mark. The water itself and all life within it falls under the jurisdiction of the HOA for the benefit and enjoyment of all residents who follow the rules. The benefit of all, Frank countered, finally looking her full in the face. His gaze was steady. Then why does it feel like the rules are only for the benefit of you, to give you something to police that struck a nerve? A splotchy red flush crept up Carol's neck. I dedicate my unpaid volunteer time to maintaining the value and integrity of this neighborhood. Mr. Miller, I protect our shared investment from people like you, who believe they are above the community, people who, with their selfish actions, drag everything down. He remembered the first letter. He had been sitting right here on this dock when he'd opened it. The official Harmony Creek letterhead, a stark contrast to the rustic wood. $50. He'd scoffed, crumpled it up, and used it to help start his evening fire in the chimenea. It was an absurdity, a joke. The second letter, a week later, felt less like a joke and more like a threat. $100, failure to remediate, it said. That one he didn't burn. He left it on his kitchen counter, a reminder of the creeping foolishness that was trying to seep under his door. Let me be perfectly clear, Carol continued, her voice now cold and sharp as broken glass. This is your final warning. If the full amount is not paid within 7 business days, we will have no choice but to place a lien on your property. Furthermore, a formal notice of your continued noncompliance will be circulated in the monthly community newsletter. Your neighbors deserve to know who is actively undermining the standards we all agreed to uphold. The threat hung in the air, ugly and final. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about public shaming. It was about turning his neighbors against him. It was about taking his home, his sanctuary, and painting a target on it. He looked past her, at the sprawling, identical houses that ring the lake, homes with perfect lawns, devoid of dandelions or character. He remembered when this was all just woods and fields. He and Martha had built their small house with their own hands, a place of refuge that was truly theirs. Now it was just a lot number in a planned community, subject to the whims of a woman who thought a worm was an ecological disaster. Carol mistook his silence for surrender. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. The choice is yours, Miller. Comply, or face the consequences. She turned with a flourish, her lieutenants falling in to step behind her. Their golf cart, the preferred vehicle of the Harmony Creek Patrol, whisked them away, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the deep gash she had torn in the fabric of his mourning. Frank sat there for a long time, the fishing rod forgotten in his hands. The joy was gone. The peace was shattered. He looked at his small, aging house, then out at the vast, shimmering lake. She had called it a community asset. She had threatened him with liens and public humiliation over a worm. He felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in his chest. It was an anger he hadn't felt in years. They had mistaken his quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken his desire for peace as an invitation to be governed. They had pushed him, not just into a corner, but off the very dock he was sitting on. And as he stared at the water, a new idea began to form. It was a wild, audacious, and utterly terrifying idea. But it was also perfect. They wanted to use the lake to control him. Fine. He wouldn't just fight them for it. He would take it all. The cold, hard anger that had settled in Frank Miller's chest did not demand a loud, immediate release. It was a patient fury, a low, burning ember that he banked carefully, knowing he would need its heat for the long campaign ahead. He had spent a lifetime diagnosing the hidden ailments of engines, listening for the subtle miss in a rhythm, tracing wires back to their source. He would now apply that same meticulous discipline to dismantling the machine that was the Harmony Creek Estates HOA. His first stop was not a lawyer's office, but the County Hall of Records, a cavernous old building downtown that smelled of dusty paper and fading ink. For 2 full days, he became a ghost haunting its archives. He learned to navigate the clunky digital terminals. his calloused fingers tapping slowly on the keyboard, pulling up decades of property deeds and zoning variances. He scrolled through countless microfilm reels, the blurry text making his eyes ache, piecing together the history of the land long before it was called Harmony Creek. He saw the initial purchase by a hopeful developer, the subdivision into pristine lots, and the eventual creation of the HOA. The critical discovery came on the third day, buried deep within a thick ledger of miscellaneous land parcels. It was Parcel 7B, a sprawling, amoeba-shaped plot labeled simply retention pond and adjoining green space. It was the lake. He traced its ownership history forward, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. The developer had transferred the residential lots to homeowners and the management of the common areas to the HOA, but they had never formally transferred the deed for the lake itself. It remained the property of a shadowy entity called Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC. A quick search of state business records painted a clearer picture. Oak Ridge Holdings was a ghost corporation, a legal shell the original developer had created and then abandoned after the last house was sold and the money was made. Their only remaining activity was paying the substantial annual property taxes on the lake, a financial drain with zero return. The HOA, Frank realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated clarity, was a tenant playing at being a landlord. They had all the bluster and none of the legal title. Carol Preston was the queen of a castle made of sand. Returning to Harmony Creek was like re-entering a different world, one where perception was reality. His quiet absence had been noticed, and in the vacuum of information, the community had written its own narrative. Frank Miller had been put in his place. Carol Preston, basking in her perceived victory, made her next move. The Harmony Herald, the community's monthly newsletter, was delivered. It was usually filled with fluff about garden club meetings and reminders to hide garbage cans. But this month, on the second page, was a thinly veiled parable titled "Good Fences Make Good Neighbors." It spoke of the sacred trust of community living and warned of the corrosive effect of individuals who place their own selfish desires above the common good. It referenced unapproved activities along the lakefront and assured residents that the board was taking decisive action to protect the shared jewel of their neighborhood. It didn't need his name. Everyone knew. The change was palpable. Tom, his neighbor to the left, who usually spent 20 minutes complaining about the weather with Frank over the fence, now gave only a curt nod before quickly starting his leaf blower, creating a wall of noise between them. At the grocery store, he saw two women from the neighborhood whispering by the dairy case. They fell silent and walked away the moment they saw him approach. He was no longer just Frank, the quiet widower who kept to himself. He was a problem, a threat to their harmonious, regulated existence. The loneliness was a palpable thing, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He took his meticulously organized folder of research to a lawyer named David Chen, whose office was in a city an hour away, far from the HOA's sphere of influence. Chen was a young, sharp-dressed man who listened with an unnerving stillness as Frank laid out the deeds, the corporate filings, and the HOA's bylaws on his polished mahogany desk. Frank explained the situation factually, keeping the emotion out of his voice, presenting it as a problem with a clear, logical solution. When Frank finished, Chen was silent for a full minute, looking from the documents to Frank and back again. A slow, incredulous smile began to form on his face. "Mr. Miller," he said, leaning back and lacing his fingers behind his head, "I handle contract disputes, corporate litigation, bitter divorces, and in all my years, I have never seen a plan for revenge so elegant, so precise, and so thoroughly devastating. It's not just legal, it's biblical. You're not just trying to win an argument, you're planning to buy the whole mountain. I absolutely have to be a part of this." Chen's firm drafted a professional, discreet letter to the registered agent of Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC. It was a simple, unsolicited offer to acquire Parcel 7B, a piece of non-performing land that was costing them money every year. The offer was low, an opening gambit in a game they were now playing on a field the HOA didn't even know existed. While they waited, the HOA escalated its local campaign. Frank was watering his hydrangeas one morning when a small work crew arrived in a Harmony Creek utility truck. Leading them, clipboard in hand, was Carol Preston herself. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the triumphal energy radiating from her arm. They marched to the edge of his lawn and, with theatrical precision, hammered a large, professionally made sign into the earth. It stood directly in front of his dock, a brown and white sentinel of HOA power. Community Recreation Area 3, it declared in bold letters, used by permit only, fishing, swimming, and boating prohibited without express written consent of the HOA board. Violators will be prosecuted. It was a declaration of war, planted on the very border of his sanctuary. He watched Carol survey her handiwork, her head held high, a general who had just secured a key fortification. She thought she was winning. Frank said nothing. He just turned off his hose and went back inside. Let her have her sign. She was celebrating a victory in a battle, blind to the war she had already lost. The email from David Chen arrived a week later. Oak Ridge Holdings had responded. They had countered. The number they proposed was astronomical. It was a life-altering sum of money that made Frank's breath catch in his throat. It was more than the value of his house. It was his entire 401k, the stocks he'd held for decades, the emergency funds he and Martha had painstakingly built. It was everything. That night, he couldn't sit still. He paced the confines of his small house, the house he'd built with his own two hands. He pulled out his financial statements, the black and white numbers representing a lifetime of hard work, of saving, of planning for a secure and quiet old age. He could just pay the HOA fine. He could sell his house and move away, find another lake, another quiet place free from the tyranny of Carol Preston. That would be the sensible thing to do. But then he looked out the window, past the smug, insulting sign, to the dark water of the lake shimmering under the moonlight. That was his peace. That was his connection to Martha. It was the last piece of their shared dream. Carol and the HOA hadn't just fined him for fishing. They had tried to steal that from him. They had tried to fine his memories, to regulate his grief. They thought his peace was a commodity they could control. He looked at the number on the screen one last time. It wasn't a price. It was a ransom, the ransom for his own life. With a steady hand, he picked up the phone and dialed David Chen. "Tell them we accept their offer," he said, his voice as calm and solid as the foundation of his home. "And let's get the paperwork started immediately." The 3 weeks that followed were the longest of Frank's life. It was a period of unnerving silence and frantic, invisible activity. He was in escrow. The word itself sounded sterile and confining. A legal purgatory where his entire life savings were held in limbo. He had sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling. The astronomical number from the sale agreement burned into his mind. He would wake in a cold sweat, the sensible part of his brain screaming at him about the sheer, irreversible folly of his actions. He was 71 years old. This was the time for preservation, for safeguarding, not for wagering everything on a single defiant act. He made the necessary trips to banks and brokerage firms, places he hadn't visited in years. He sat in plush chairs across from financial advisors who looked at him with a mixture of professional courtesy and deep, personal concern. They spoke of diversification, of long-term security, of market volatility. Frank listened patiently, then instructed them to sell. Sell it all. The blue-chip stocks he'd held since the 80s, the mutual funds Martha had researched so carefully, the municipal bonds that were supposed to be his unbreachable safety net. He signed the papers, his hand steady, but his heart pounding but a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. With each signature, he felt a piece of his past turning to liquid, flowing away from him into the vast, anonymous river of capital. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, the victory lap continued, believing Frank to be thoroughly vanquished. The HOA, under Carol's increasingly autocratic leadership, grew bolder. A new flurry of notices went out. The approved color palette for garden gnomes was now restricted to 3 specific shades of red and blue. Holiday decorations were not to be erected more than 14 days before the specific holiday and must be dismantled within 7 days after. A resident was fined for having a basketball hoop that was, according to the board's measurement, 3/4 of an inch too close to the sidewalk. It was madness, a slow strangulation by 1,000 tiny rules. Frank watched it all from his porch. A silent observer, he paid his property taxes, he mowed his lawn, letting the edges grow just a little shaggier than regulation allowed. He was a ghost in his own neighborhood. A cautionary tale the other residents could point to. His quiet compliance was seen as proof of his defeat. The final closing was done remotely. David Chen walked him through the mountain of digital paperwork over the phone. The final document was the wire transfer authorization. Frank clicked the button, and in the sterile, anticlimactic silence of his study, his life savings vanished from his account. For a full minute, he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. He was financially ruined. He had traded a comfortable, secure future for a muddy body of water and a principal. Then the phone rang. It was David Chen. Well, Frank. His lawyer's voice was warm, tinged with something that sounded like awe. The wire has been received. The deed was recorded with the county clerk at 3:15 p.m. It's done. Congratulations. Mr. Miller, you own the lake. Frank hung up the phone. He walked out to his porch and looked at the water. It was the same lake, the same gentle ripples, the same sun glinting off its surface. But it was different now. It was his. The hollowness inside him was replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of peace. He had not bought a lake. He had bought back his sanctuary. He had bought the right to be left alone. His first act as the new owner was not grand or loud. He went to his workshop, the place where he used to fix engines and now tinkered with his fishing reels. He found a wide, sturdy piece of pine board and a set of old stencils. With black paint, he carefully stenciled a new sign. He wasn't a man for fancy words. He wanted something simple, something clear. The sign took him 2 days to make, letting the paint dry properly in the sun. On the third day, a clear, bright Tuesday morning, Frank acted. He took a shovel and a post hole digger from his shed and walked directly to the HOA sign. He didn't hesitate. He dug around its base, loosened the concrete, and pulled the entire thing out of the ground. Pole and all, he dragged it to the side of his house, to be disposed of later like any other piece of trash. In its place, he planted his own, a simple wooden post, with his hand-painted pine board bolted to it. It faced the community, its message stark against the manicured green lawn, in big, bold letters. It read, "Fish free or D." And just below, in slightly smaller letters, he added the punchline, "HOA mad." But he wasn't done. He had spent the previous evening printing a dozen other signs on his home computer, laminating them carefully at the local copy shop. They looked official, professional. He walked the entire perimeter of the lake, from the edge of his property all the way around the manicured walking paths and common areas of Harmony Creek. At every single community access point, the small sandy beach, the communal boat launch, the grassy picnic area, he hammered in a sign. Private property, Harmony Lake owned and operated by F. Miller, LLC. Trespassing is strictly prohibited. Access is by invitation only. Then came the masterstroke. Taped below each sign, in a waterproof plastic sleeve, was an addendum. Notice to residents of Harmony Creek Estates. Effective immediately. Harmony Lake and its surrounding shoreline are private property due to a history of targeted harassment, bad faith enforcement, and the deliberate creation of a hostile living environment by the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association Board. Access to the lake is hereby prohibited for all current HOA board members and their households. This restriction will remain in effect until the board is dissolved or a new board is elected. All other residents are welcome by invitation, pending a review of community records. We apologize for any inconvenience. He returned to his dock, his work finished. He set up his old folding chair, baited his hook with a fat, wriggling earthworm from his compost pile, and cast his line into the shimmering, sunlit water, his water. He didn't have to wait long. The bobber had barely settled before a car screeched to a halt at the end of the cul-de-sac. A resident, out for her morning power walk, was staring, phone in hand, at the sign near the picnic area. Frank watched her frantically dial a number. He knew who she was calling. The gears of the machine were grinding to a halt, and its queen would soon be coming to see why. Frank smiled, a genuine, happy smile. The fish were biting. The sound arrived first, an angry, high-pitched whine that was entirely out of place in the morning symphony of birdsong and lapping water. It was the sound of an electric motor being pushed far beyond its intended purpose. Frank didn't flinch. He recognized it as the sound of approaching fury, the sound of Carol Preston's official HOA golf cart, her chariot of righteous indignation, coming to a reckoning. It tore across the manicured parkland and screeched to a halt at the edge of his property, its tires spitting clumps of perfect grass onto his slightly too long lawn. Before the cart had fully settled, Carol was out, her body rigid with a rage so profound it seemed to generate its own gravitational field. Her floral blouse, usually a symbol of cheerful order, now looked like camouflage for a predator. Stan and Brenda tumbled out after her, their faces etched with a shared look of dread. They were not here as enforcers. They were here as unwilling witnesses to an execution. Miller. Her voice was not a shout, it was a weapon, sharp and piercing. She marched forward until her sensible shoes were inches from the demarcation line between the community's turf and his own. She pointed a trembling finger. Not at him, but at his hand-painted sign. You have 60 seconds to explain this monstrosity before I call the sheriff's department. What is the meaning of the blatant, criminal act of vandalism? Frank remained seated, with an agonizingly slow and deliberate motion. He placed his fishing rod into its holder on the dock. He reached for a battered metal thermos, unscrewed the cap, and poured a small amount of coffee into it. The silence was punctuated only by the sound of the pouring liquid and Carol's heavy, furious breathing. He took a slow sip, savoring the warmth, before finally turning to face her. "Good morning, Carol," he said, his voice maddeningly placid. "Stan, Brenda, I was just thinking what a lovely morning it is." "Don't you dare," she shrieked, taking another step forward, her entire body quivering. "This isn't a social call. This is a formal notice of extreme violation. You have defaced and removed community property. You have erected an unauthorized structure in a common area. You are in violation of zoning aesthetics, signage ordinances, Section 4, subsection B, and the General Covenant of Conduct, Stan. Are you getting this down?" Stan, who looked like he'd rather be swallowed by the earth, shook his head mutely. "Carol, I don't have..." "Then use your brain, Stan." She snapped, her laser-like focus returning to Frank. "This is the end of the line. Miller, no more fines, no more warnings. We are proceeding with immediate legal action. Our lawyer will have a lien on this house by noon tomorrow. We will bleed you dry in court fees. When we are done, the HOA will own this sad little shack you call a home." Frank listened to the tirade with a patient stillness. When she finally ran out of breath, he let the silence hang for a long moment. He stood up slowly, every movement economical and calm. He picked up a large manila envelope from the tackle box at his feet. "There are several problems with that plan, Carol," he said, his voice even and clear. "The biggest one being that you can't enforce HOA rules on a property the HOA doesn't own or manage." Carol let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What in God's name are you talking about? The board of the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association has full jurisdictional authority over this lake." "It is a community asset," Frank said, the single word landing with the force of a physical blow. It was a community asset. As of 3:15 p.m. yesterday, it became a private one. He held up the manila envelope. "This is a certified and recorded copy of the deed of sale for Parcel 7B, which I believe you know as Harmony Lake. including all literal rights in adjoining lands designated as common areas. It was transferred from the previous owners, Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC, to the new owners, F. Miller, LLC, a corporation of which I am the founder, president, and sole shareholder. The world seemed to stop. Carol's face, which had been a mask of crimson rage, drained of all color, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. Her mind, so adept at navigating the twisted corridors of bylaws and regulations, had just slammed headfirst into the unbreachable granite wall of property law. Stan took a step back, then another, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of a man on a ship who has just realized the captain has steered them directly onto the rocks. Brenda's mouth hung open, her face a blank canvas of pure shock. You're lying, Carol whispered, the words ragged and hollow. It's a trick, a fake. My lawyer's name is David Chen. His number is on the letterhead of the notices I posted, Frank said, his voice retaining its inhuman calm. He would be delighted to confirm the deed's authenticity with your legal counsel. Except you don't have one, do you, Carol? The HOA's entire legal strategy is just you, writing angry letters. This isn't an argument. This is the end of the game. He then gestured towards her and her two stunned deputies. And since this is now private property, and since my corporation has a very strict policy against harassment and bad faith actors, I must inform you that all three of you are trespassing. I need you to remove yourselves from my property immediately. The word trespassing, their word. Their weapon is the final fatal thrust, and Stan didn't even look at Carol. He turned on his heel, his movements stiff with panic, and practically ran back to the golf cart. He threw himself into the passenger seat, his only thought clearly being to escape the blast radius. Brenda, after a moment of frozen indecision, scurried after him, her face a picture of misery. The Praetorian Guard had abandoned the Empress. Carol stood alone, a solitary, pathetic figure on a lawn she no longer controlled, facing a lake she could no longer touch. Her power had not just been challenged, it had been bought, paid for, and rendered utterly void. It had evaporated in the space of a single, devastating sentence. Her shoulders, once so square with authority, slumped. She gave Frank one last look, a look of such profound, venomous hatred that it was almost pitiful. Then, defeated, she turned, walked with the slow, shuffling gait of a broken woman back to the golf cart, and drove away. Not with a screech of fury, but with a quiet, pathetic hum of retreat. By lunchtime, the story had saturated Harmony Creek. It was whispered over hedges, debated on text chains, and dissected in driveways. A slow but steady parade of cars and golf carts made their way down the cul-de-sac, their drivers slowing to stare at the hand-painted sign, which had now become a local landmark. They looked at Frank, sitting calmly on his dock, with a new and complex cocktail of emotions, shock, disbelief, and in many cases, a deep, secret, and liberating sense of glee. He was no longer Frank the troublemaker, he was Frank the legend. That evening, as the sun began its descent, casting a golden glow over his lake, Frank saw his neighbor Tom approaching, not with a mower or a leaf blower, but with a six-pack of craft beer held out in front of him like a diplomatic offering. Frank, Tom said, stopping at a respectful distance, the whole neighborhoods have been talking. He shook his head in disbelief. Man, I gotta tell you, I'm sorry for being a lousy neighbor. We all saw what Carol was doing, and we just kept our heads down. It was easier, I understand, Tom, Frank said, and he truly did. But what you did, Tom's face broke into a massive grin. That wasn't just good, that was epic. A story they'll be telling here for 50 years. He hesitated. So, the signs, are you really? Frank let out a low chuckle. No, Tom, I'm not banning the residents. I'm just banning the board that was making our lives hell. He gestured with his head toward an empty folding chair next to his. Why don't you have a seat? I've got a spare rod. The evening bite is the best time. As Tom eagerly settled in. Frank looked out at the water, his water. He felt Martha's presence not as a sad memory, but as a warm, approving peace. He had spent his life savings, his security, everything a man his age is supposed to cling to. But he hadn't bought a lake. He had bought freedom. He had bought the quiet, non-negotiable right to his own happiness. He had not just defended his sanctuary, he had liberated an entire community from a petty tyrant, one fishing line at a time. And that, he thought, was a better investment than any stock he had ever owned. The final showdown unfolded with gripping intensity. Carol, seething with fury and flanked by Stan and Brenda, confronted Frank in a storm of accusations and legal threats. But Frank, unnervingly calm, let her tirade exhaust itself before methodically revealing the truth: he was the new legal owner of the lake. He held up notarized ownership documents as proof. The revelation shattered Carol's world and her power completely. Frank then announced, with quiet authority, that she and the rest of the HOA board were trespassing on private property and ordered them to leave. One by one, even her loyal followers abandoned her. Humiliated and defeated, Carol retreated in disgrace. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire, and Frank quickly became a local legend. The story closed on a quieter note. Tom, Frank's neighbor, showed up with a six-pack of beer and a heartfelt apology. Frank welcomed him warmly and invited him to stay and fish. He made it clear his goal was never domination, but peace. He hadn't just reclaimed his own freedom, he had liberated the entire community from the HOA's oppressive rule. And so the gentle ripples of Harmony Lake returned to a state of peace. But it is a peace that was not given, but earned. It was bought and paid for not just with money, but with courage. Frank Miller's story is more than just a tale of epic revenge against a power-tripping homeowners association. It's a profound meditation on what home truly means. It's a testament to the idea that a person's sanctuary, that small piece of the world where they find their solace and connect with their memories, is a thing worth fighting for, no matter the kind. We watched Frank, a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his fishing rod and his thoughts of a life well lived, get pushed into a corner. He was targeted by a system that had forgotten its purpose. An HOA, meant to uphold community value, had instead become a vehicle for one woman's obsession with control. Carol Preston's power was built on a fragile scaffold of bylaws, fines, and public shaming. It was a phantom power, effective only as long as people feared it. What she never understood was that Frank Miller wasn't fighting her rules. He was fighting for a principle that was far older and more powerful than any community covenant: the right to be sovereign within his own life. When he liquidated his entire life savings, it wasn't an act of spite. It was an act of profound love for his late wife, Martha, love for the life they built, and love for the peace he was promised. He sacrificed his financial security, the bedrock of his golden years, for something intangible yet infinitely more valuable. He reminded us that some things are not for sale, but some things must be bought back when they are stolen. He didn't just buy a lake, he bought the silence that Carol's threats had shattered. He bought the right to cast a line with a simple worm on the hook without justifying it to anyone. He bought his freedom. This story resonates so deeply because, in a way, we have all met a Carol Preston. We have all faced a system, big or small, that seemed designed to crush the individual spirit under the weight of its own absurd regulations. Frank did what so many of us only dream of doing. He didn't just find a loophole, he bought the whole rulebook and set it on fire. His victory feels so satisfying because it wasn't just a win for him. It was a win for every person who has ever felt voiceless against an unfeeling bureaucracy. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Frank's quiet defiance is a powerful lesson. We hope it leaves you with as much to think about as it did for us. What does home mean to you? What is your sanctuary, and how far would you go to protect it? We would be honored if you would share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of one man's quiet war for peace resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button. It truly helps us bring more stories like this to light. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. So you never miss a tale of an ordinary person's extraordinary stand. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force on earth is a good person who has simply had enough. Because in the end, Frank Miller taught us that a man's peace is his castle, and sometimes, to protect that castle, you have to buy the entire kingdom.